Railgun intern here, and welcome to an exciting deep dive into the world of Railgun and private Ethereum. And today I'm joined by Alan and Kai. We're going to explore the progress of Railgun's privacy mission through a storytelling lens, from the challenges of engineering for blockchain to the exciting developments allowing privacy to thrive in DeFi. We'll cover it all. So, Alan, thanks so much for being here. Can you kick us off with a quick intro about yourself and the role that you have at Railgun?
Yeah, sure. People who know me in the project know me as maybe Hallelujah churchgoer in all the chats. Been contributing to the project now. I can't believe it. It's been 4 years now. And, as the name suggests, I do all of the janitorial services that is not coding. So yeah, I spend my days on the more soft skills side of things.
We also have Kai here with us. Kai, would you mind also giving us a quick intro about yourself and what you do?
I am Kai. I have been doing something or another crypto related for, well, it's been a bit over 10 years now, right? I am mostly a code and maths nerd, so most of the time I'm just staring at squiggly lines, and that's pretty much my day in, day out.
So as we said, we're going to take a look at Railgun through a storytelling lens. And every good story needs a hero's journey. So let's start at the beginning. How did Railgun come to exist? Was there a white paper or a founder? And why was privacy the thing that you wanted to solve?
Yeah, I'd love to take a crack at this first. It's a sort of interesting story, at least from my perspective. I'd love to hear Kai's take on this too, frankly. Railgun did start out as a white paper. I guess it must have been like late 2020, early 2021. And the whole premise of this paper was that like privacy could happen on chain. There could be a privacy mechanism that exists that could be used for DeFi in the DeFi ecosystem. At that time, there was a lot of stuff that was coming up in the world of like Ethereum privacy that were sort of like L2, maybe like a side chain, or, now they're calling themselves like, layer zeros and things like this. But like the premise was that like you could use current cryptography, things that exist, boring old, EIPs that exist for Ethereum and do a privacy solution. And it could just be smart contract based. It doesn't have to have like some sort of like, crazy bridging mechanism or something like that in there. And you could sort of like have your cake and eat it too. And so like the premise of the paper was to, basically outline a way to do this in a sort of like general perspective, right? And, privacy is really, really quite important. Making sure that it's, a sort of uncompromising solution like, what Railgun ultimately ended up being is really quite important. We've seen since Railgun's deployment, there's been different privacy solutions that have, sort of come and gone or been shuttered by centralized teams and things like this. And, that kind of is a challenge in the space. You don't want to get used to using some sort of solution to find out that the devs are going to say, oh, like, psych, just kidding. This was running on Steve's AWS server and, we're going to kill it now. So please get your money out of our system. And that was kind of like the whole thought process behind it. Like, let's build something that's really cool and decentralized. And, that's kind of how like the Railgun privacy project, if you will, got together. There was a beta deployment in 21, and it's sort of been like a constant evolution since there, and making it better, making it cheaper, making it more extensible. That's where a lot of the research comes in, day to day, and it's been a really, really kind of fun ride. Yeah, I would say that's kind of like the overarching, like how it started story, at least from my perspective.
Involved with this whole railgun thing in very, very different ways, or maybe not so different. But the biggest challenge for me day to day was actually around privacy, right? I don't want everyone that I ever interact with or people that they interact with to then know like, oh, well, how much do I have? Or if I'm going to be using this day to day, what coffee shop do you go and get your morning coffee at? What time do you go and get that? I see you've got this amount in the wallet that you use to pay at that coffee shop, right? Around about the time when this white paper was circulating, one of my buddies had called me up and said, have you seen this white paper? You've done some like privacy projects in the past and all. Like, I think you might be interested. And so I took a look, and I poked around a bit and kind of found like, oh, okay, well, there's actually a fairly engaged community here that's interested in making a real solution to this privacy problem that we have, and isn't really willing to compromise. And so I looked at this and I was like, oh, okay, well, cool. Like, these people get it, and I sort of just dove in from there.
Every hero hears a call to action. And for Railgun, that call was to bring privacy as a default to crypto without compromising security or decentralization. How did zero knowledge proofs like ZK snarks become the magic sword in this quest? And why did you focus on Ethereum versus a different chain or something like Bitcoin?
Yeah, zero knowledge proofs, they're kind of the natural answer to doing this as a smart contract style system, right? If you were to go off and build your own blockchain, the design space that you have to play with is much larger, right? You can kind of pick and choose different cryptographic techniques and different primitives. And sort of there's a lot of different ways you can construct a privacy system, and maybe that involves CK stocks, or maybe that involves some other techniques like fully homomorphic encryption or these other sort of protocols. But when you're building it on top of Ethereum, you have a natural challenge response, or like request response model, right? So the way that everyone interacts with Ethereum is you have some bit of code and associated storage that exists on chain. And then off chain, you have your private key, and you sign a particular message with some particular inputs, which when you present it to this code that runs on chain, when it executes, it gives you some particular like desired outcome. In Ethereum, like this entire process is entirely public, and there's no privacy there at all. But when you're trying to introduce privacy into the system, well, the natural like solution there is ZK snarks, right? It fits fairly nicely into off chain. You have your private key. Instead of creating a ECDSA signature, you generate a ZK snark proof to show that these inputs are valid. You then present the proof to the bit of code running on chain or a smart contract, and that smart contract then checks that the proof is valid and gives you some desired outcome that you want. Right. So I think like the way that ZK snarks work just fits really cleanly into the way that like Ethereum transactions work. The other part of that question there is why Ethereum? And that's a fairly simple answer. The vast majority of DeFi activity and all these use cases and all, they're all built on Ethereum. And so if you want to bring privacy to the largest number of users, the largest number of economic activity, well, Ethereum's a natural choice.
On the topic of expanding privacy on Ethereum, I've heard rumors about new chain deployments. Can we leak some of this information to the community and maybe when they might expect these deployments?
Yeah, there was a really interesting conversation that's sort of been evolving through the last couple of weeks and months, and it's around Kraken's chain Ink. So Ink's an optimism based L2. So we've sort of been collaborating with the Ink team to push a deployment on this new Kraken L2, if you will. So it's pretty exciting to have this sort of like large player inbound engagement, at least from my perspective. So I'm hoping to see something like a proposal come up in the next couple of weeks to do this deployment. I think it'll be really cool.
In a hero's journey, the hero often hesitates before diving in. Were there moments early on where you questioned whether this was something worth pursuing or whether the project would even survive?
I had a real job before I started contributing to Railgun. So, there was always the, I'm like quitting a real job to go into a fake job in magical internet money land. And, that was met with reasonable criticism from people that I know in like, real life. I even remember my, friends and family, asking me if I'd be able to pay a mortgage with different shit coins that they had managed to find on the internet. And so from a personal perspective, for sure, it was kind of like, oh man, this is kind of a big jump and a foray out into the unknown. But, even with like Railgun, initially, if you go back and you look at the project when it first come out, it was it was sort of like a bear market. It wasn't really great. In fact, any cool new deployments, things that happen in Railgun land tend to be met with bear markets. And it seems like, currently it's no exception. But suffice it to say, the bear market was pretty big. But even from like a mechanical perspective, the project faced a lot of challenges. A Railgun transaction in beta was several $100s. I mean, you could spend $800 in gas on a Railgun transaction when it had first come out. I don't know about you guys, but I don't want to spend $800 on a transaction. It's a lot of money. And, that was certainly a big challenge. But then there was also like the consideration for gas payer and trying to solve for anonymizing who's paying gas. This was a really big lift. And then things like balance scanning and the constant evolution and research that is required to like sort of make Railgun into something that people want to use and can use and, want to integrate into a wallet. It's sort of been a continuous challenge, most certainly. But, as time has gone on, it's sort of worked out. Railgun transactions used to be, several $100s on Ethereum, and now it's $1. Right. And, that's a lot of different things at play, the ecosystem at large, scaling and becoming, cheaper as a chain. But, also a lot of research into, how to do Railgun transactions. And so I think that the sort of like uncertainty and like doubt is well behind us, but there were certainly points in history where like, even, FUD and, different, attacks on the protocol aside, there were some like mechanical challenges in the ecosystem that really were like, I don't know how we're going to make a Railgun transaction not be several $100s. Fast forward to today in 2025, that's just not the case.
I think most of it's just probably working in crypto really sucks, right? Probably the most like ridiculous stuff is just, or the most ridiculous attacks are probably from within the crypto industry itself. Maybe if we can stop cannibalizing ourselves, might have a better chance at all of this. But I think besides that, the thing with like Railgun is there's a lot of kind of like hidden complexity in trying to design around the restrictions that are imposed with a smart contract system like Ethereum. And there are a number of EIPs that have come out that may kind of broaden the scope of what you can do with Ethereum, and maybe it starts to become easier to develop these ZK applications. But right at the start, there was some like real questions around like, all right, cool, well, this is a very gas intensive operation, and then trying to take that and then put in like cross contract interactions as well, trying to like see you've got these like just within like a Railgun, right? A Railgun to Railgun transaction, that's fairly gas intensive. But then when you're going off and doing a cross contract interaction, that's like you have to take the tokens from your Railgun wallet, interact with whatever DeFi application, and then you have to take those and reshield that, right? And so you just kind of add these gas costs up. And so I think the biggest question mark as to whether this could succeed was really around the gas. As Alan mentioned, the gas cost used to be quite substantial, and now it's definitely a lot more palatable.
Well, every hero needs guidance, and Railgun has had some incredible allies, like Gnosis Guild for development of mechs, which we'll talk about later, Chainway for proof of innocence, or even Vitalik Butrin's public support. How did these and other mentors shape the Railgun path? And what was it like when Vitalik tweeted about Railgun in April 2024, calling privacy normal?
It's pretty cool, right? It's really sort of validating, isn't it? I've said this a couple of times, a couple of places, but, it sort of feels like, DeFi Jesus turning water into your brand of wine. It feels really good. And so that's definitely been really, really cool. Vitalik has a really big platform, and he could talk about many things. And it's really cool that, he could talk about whatever he wants, right? But it's really cool that he's taken up, a very similar stance and, wants to talk about privacy and why it's important, and, very frequently references the Railgun project as something that is doing that, right? It's pretty cool. And, above and beyond that, there's been a lot of contributors around Railgun. that have made things, that have like built stuff. You talked about the Gnosis Guild. We've been chatting with those guys for a long time. I've known Auron and some of those dudes for several years now, and we've talked about privacy and what private multisigs might look like, and different ways to control external accounts from a Railgun 0ZK address, being able to like lean on these people and, sort of like brainstorm about things with, like-minded people who are, excited about the same stuff has been really, really powerful, I would say. Chainway and their whole proof of innocence mechanism when they put it up for Tornado Cash was really fascinating to me because, it was sort of like a way that you could have your privacy and make a really interesting and like complex statement about the nature of your deposits, right? And like the provenance of your funds. And that's really cool. A lot of privacy solutions have a thing called a view key. And the problem with a view key is that it's irrevocable, right? So once you give that up, that's that, right? For whatever that viewing key exposes. You no longer have privacy and can't actually assume that you have privacy from anyone from that point forward once you reveal that to somebody. And so, sort of having this ability to do a zero knowledge statement of your private balance was a really interesting thing. And getting to work with those guys was really fascinating. And, PPOI, the private proof of innocence mechanism, has been really, really cool, and has gotten a lot of recognition in the ecosystem. Everyone who's contributed to the project has like shaped it in some way. People have, contributed to the project that aren't really, heavily publicly known, that have put together some really cool and complex tech that I'll be grateful for, that's for sure. I think that everyone who contributes to a project like this, a DeFi, a true decentralized project, sort of like shape it.
And what I will say about the Vitalik tweet is I've never gotten out of bed so quickly in my life. But no, I think, it has been pretty good to see just the breadth of different contributors in contributing to Railgun in various capacities, right? Quite like oftentimes they're just like come out of nowhere and then just have this like weird bit of tech that they have to show. But yeah, I think one thing I am excited to see about the Gnosis Guild guys contributing as well is Gnosis is sort of this like all the various things that they've kind of put out is they have this very strict non-compromising attitude on like, no, we're not going to take like the shortcut or the easy way to right, we'll just paper over this with like an admin key or whatever and just that's fine, we can solve it later, right? They've actually put in the hard yards of building out all of these different systems like the safe multisig and all, right, in ways that are really trust minimized, right, and like truly non-custodial and decentralized, right? And I think that's just like a natural sort of philosophical alignment between the stuff the Gnosis do and guiding principles behind Railgun. I am really excited to see the Gnosis people coming in and contributing to Railgun as well, just as a nice sort of validation that we're kind of on the right track with this project.
Now, in every good story, there's a point where the hero has to commit to the adventure, and Railgun crossed a big threshold with milestones like version 1.0 and proof of innocence. Can you walk us through how proof of innocence works and why it's a game changer for balancing privacy and accountability? And how does this open the floodgates for privacy adoption?
So there was this team called Chainway, right? And Chainway, what they did was they built this system for people to take and basically demonstrate that they aren't on the OFAC sanctions list without revealing which deposits they were, specifically outside of that subset of bad actors. In other words, people who were using Tornado Cash could take and generate a private proof, a privacy preserving proof that they weren't a bad actor. And that was really, really cool. I thought that was a very interesting thing that you could do, right? Because that's something that people talk about this kind of thing all the time in ZK, right? They say like, oh, well, whenever you want to get into a bar, right, you want to prove that you're of age and can enter the bar and drink, right? And you don't want to show the dude at the door your driver's license or something like this because it has other things that they don't need to know. Arguably, they don't actually need to know your name. They don't need to know your driver's license number. They actually don't even need to know your birthday. They don't need to know your address or whatever else might be on there, right? Whether you're an organ donor or not. All they need to know is, are you old enough to get into this place, right? And so you could take and do this in a zero knowledge way. And so this was kind of like a first like real world use case that I had saw that I thought was really interesting, could be applicable to Railgun. And so, I reached out to their team and said, hey, this would be really cool if we could collaborate and build something like this for Railgun. We had gone out into the marketplace and sort of chatted with a lot of different people in the world about like what this thing was after. A lot of analytics firms raised their hands to be sort of list providers for this, if you will. The likes of Elliptic, Purify, Slow Mist, Scam Sniffer. The list sort of goes on, but there's a lot of different people who are, willing to sort of collaborate on this kind of thing. And so it's been like a really interesting foray into, I don't think you can really call it compliance because there isn't a compliance regime, at least to my knowledge, in the world that has a stipulation for zero knowledge statements, but it is a really interesting mechanism that makes a stance against allowing bad actors into the system. And it's something that I'm really excited about. I think that if we look at the metrics around the protocol, I seem to recall at the time when Private Proof of Innocence had gotten deployed, a TVL for the protocol had like 7x. And so it was sort of like proof in the pudding that like having mechanisms around, Railgun like this, that were sort of out to thwart bad actors from using the system were actually a boon for adoption and aren't something that would hinder it, because people want to know that they're not, commingling and dealing with a protocol that is out for bad actors. And so I would say it was really, really bullish at the time, and still has continued to be for the protocol.
I think the thing with like this PPY or private proof of innocence, what it really is kind of demonstrated is like, all right, cool. When you're designing these, decentralized systems and all, there's like very strong tendency for people to go and say like, oh, there's these features which can have, like these negative side effects, like privacy being the one here, right? I don't think I need to enumerate what the kind of potential problems could be, but. And the kind of response has been like, oh well, you've got this cryptography and we can make these statements. So that has always really just been a kind of like academic argument. Up until we saw the proof of innocence from Chainway, and later a much more scaled out sort of version of the same concept, PPY, on Railgun. And I think what that really shows is like, well, it takes it from this academic argument and shows like really practically that like these are things that can be done. They are being done.
PPOI sounds powerful, but can you break it down for us? How does a user use a proof of innocence in practice to prove that their funds are clean?
So as Alan brought up before, you have these kind of on-chain analytics firms that are they're able to look at the chain, and they can kind of highlight certain like nefarious activity that you may want to exclude from your privacy set. Right. And so what happens is, using the PPY mechanism, wallets can essentially go off and say, well, the provenance of my funds, right, set the shield, or at the initial shield, right, they can go off and say like, all right, well, my shield is not, in this set of nefarious activity. They can produce that shield and essentially add the output of their transaction to the set of like outputs that can be proved against. The recipient of a shield or a particular transaction can then go off and say, well, the input that I've just received, when I go off and spend that, I can then generate a proof saying, well, the inputs into my transaction are also part of this set that does not include these nefarious activities that we want to avoid. And by doing so, you can like essentially just show that without breaking any of the privacy properties beyond showing that your tokens weren't from one of these activities that you don't want in your privacy set. Right, you can produce this proof. And because it's recursive, you still retain the privacy properties of the entire set, and you're only really affecting the like activity on the tokens that you actually want to keep out of your privacy set.
Well, no journey is without obstacles, and Railgun has faced scrutiny, like concerns that privacy protocols could hide illicit activity. How does the team respond to these criticisms? And how has the community, your allies, helped push back?
It's sort of like a straw man against privacy in general, right? It's the classic, I don't have anything to hide sort of statement, right? And the reality is that we all sort of self-select how we present ourselves to the world, right? And the same is applicable for I would argue like the way that we take and transact in the world, right? So for example, you may not want it to be known publicly, political donations that you make. Maybe it's something that you want to donate to privately. Maybe you don't want people to know which, 1C3s you give money to and, what charities get your financing. Yeah, we could go into like the tinfoil hat side of things, but I think from my perspective, I've always sort of thought about privacy from a more like pragmatic perspective. I know that for sure that whenever I take and do a transaction in traditional finance, that I'm going to have peer-to-peer blinding. So when I go and I swipe my debit card or pay with my credit card online, or hell, even if I pay with cash in person, they don't know how much is in my pocket, and I don't know how much is in the till. And so this is a normal state of affairs for finance in general. So being able to take and like have that in crypto is really quite important for the overarching adoptability, if you will, of crypto, right? I think that without it, it really just won't ever take off. I see privacy as sort of like something that exists already in the ecosystem. We've just sort of like taken a step back in crypto and like haven't really been able to put it back in a really meaningful way. But we've seen all sorts of different calamity exist for lack of privacy. Things like normal auction mechanics. They sort of fail when there's no privacy. A great example of this is Constitution DAO for people who've been around at least when that happened, right? There's on-chain warfare that happens where people go and they look at the different bits of leverage that other people have and try to push price against them to liquidate them. And, we see this happen on Twitter, where they say like, oh, these guys, if price goes down to here, this dude's going to get liquidated. And, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? It's debatable. We could probably have a whole different chat about that. But, suffice it to say, like the economics of the thing have sort of, been perverse and, not really akin to traditional finance, at least in the perspective that, privacy is a thing that sort of exists. I think it won't be really unreasonable for privacy to be required in some circumstances in crypto in the future. It's kind of a facade to say that privacy is only for bad people. I think that privacy is something that we all need and appreciate and tend to use in our finances.
An argument against privacy is kind of just an argument against adoption of crypto in general. I mean, if this is a very clear problem that needs to be solved, right? If we don't solve it, then I don't see crypto being adopted, in any sort of general capacity at all. And if that's the case, then, what are we doing here? I think the outcomes that we're seeing, right, with how it's actually being used in practice, support, case that like, no, like privacy and things like railguns is a genuine necessity if we want to push this space forward. And I think more generally, there is kind of recognition of that when people talk about Railgun. And I think we've seen that with some of the support that you get to see in public discourse.
Are there any regulatory entities, government entities, or grants that might support on-chain privacy and the Railgun project?
Broadly, I think there's recognition of the role that privacy plays in civil society, right? Maybe taking like a more timely example, there's the proposed updates to the GDPR framework in the EU. And essentially one of the outcomes that is being talked about is, if private or personal data can't be deleted, then maybe the entire blockchain has to be deleted, right? And while that particular outcome might be particularly extreme, and I think is maybe like problematic for actual like real world implementation, I think there is like, at least it demonstrates that there is a recognition of the need for privacy more broadly, but also more specifically in the blockchain space. And I think the disconnect there might just be a matter of education perhaps, or just maybe a matter of a misalignment from government and regulatory entities. I'm not sure what the answer is to solving this question. I'm sure there's probably some political scientists out there or something that can maybe speak to this better. But that's kind of where we are at now.
One of the big challenges I've heard about recently is developing for atomic and non-atomic transactions and the difficulty of allowing both. Can you help us understand this challenge and how the recent proposal from Gnosis Build seeks to solve it?
The goal for Railgun, if we just look at it overarchingly beyond the DeFi interactions, is really just to say that like you could have a 0zk address do anything that 0x address can do. In other words, anything that a public address can do, a private address should be able to do it as well. That's the goal, right? In other words, like functionality being like on par with a public transaction. And so whenever the project sort of set off in, late 2020, early 21, the landscape for DeFi was much different. It was very, very, very different, right? Fundamentally, a lot of the transactions were really quite atomic, right? So you would have swaps, for example, so you'd go to Uniswap and you would swap tokens on Uniswap. And this is really, really cool, right? I mean, AMMs are a revelation, frankly. It's super cool. But, you fast forward to 2025 and, DeFi is a totally different thing now, right? I mean, there's all sorts of protocols that, do things that didn't even exist even just 4 years ago. And so, the protocol designs of today being different aside, like user habits have changed. So people, spend a lot of time bridging to and fro to different chains, right? They use protocols that aren't really atomic, and they do things that really just sort of don't really play well with how Railgun exists in its current architecture. And so it is one of the bigger challenges. So for example, there's a protocol, it's called Lido, right? And Lido is huge. It's a liquid staking protocol, and and Lido is really great because you can take and stake, and it's quite easy. But the unstaking thing isn't atomic, right? It actually takes some time for you to get tokens back, and the sort of hard and fast accounting for Railgun smart contracts isn't really a place for this kind of transaction. And so effectively, what we're working on and what the Gnosis Guild seeks to solve is basically a way to have Railgun sub-accounts, if you will, that could, take and handle these less than atomic transactions. It's quite interesting, and it, proposes to basically allow Railgun to, interact with any DeFi protocol, atomic or not. So this can be things like, leverage protocols or dealing with, limit orders and intents, doing bridging in between anonymity sets. The list really goes on. And so, I could say, at least from my perspective, this is something that'll really make Railgun much more extensible with the shape and form of DeFi today.
Back in 2020, 2021, everything executed in single transactions and these interactions that you had with various DeFi protocols. But as Ethereum has kind of progressed from there, we've seen this shift into this more modular, sort of like roll-up centric design, right? And that's sort of been Ethereum's answer to scaling issues that were being hit. We've seen the shift away from atomic transactions for a lot of DeFi interactions, and AMMs still exist on chain, but people aren't really using the AMMs directly as much anymore. They're going through these sort of solver protocols, right? And because of this, the original model for Railgun wallets interacting with other DeFi protocols has started to become a bit dated, right? So the stuff that Gnosis guys are working on, it sort of enables this multi-transaction, longer time frame interactions to occur and allows Railgun wallets to now access these newer DeFi protocols.
Another big challenge seems to be making documentation and resources around large or complex code bases that are truly open source so that other teams can build with it. Can you highlight the recent Railgun Reloaded initiative and how it will help developers adopt and use Railgun?
So you've got Wallet and Engine, and the way that you sort of build applications around this is it kind of forces you to instantiate an entire wallet in order to go out and kind of build whatever your use case may be. And Railgun's a fairly complex system. And that being the initial entry point, like for a new developer trying to build something on Railgun, it's quite a big hurdle to solve. And so like I think there's been quite a few different hackathon projects that I've personally seen where there's a fairly good idea and a fairly good design, and it the sort of like teams go off and they attempt to build it, and then they hit this sort of problem of like, oh, I need to basically build an entire wallet around my application. It's talking about like developer experience or DevX, right? This is very poor DevX. So yeah, the idea behind the like Railgun Reloaded project is basically to take this SDK architecture and kind of break it down into its own like component pieces, so that you can, if you're not building, or if you just want to build like a dApp front end or something like this, you don't need to go and instantiate an entire wallet. You can sort of pick out the parts that you need and get running with those. And the sort of like side effect of this is, because you have these different like parts of the system in these sort of like self-contained modules, it makes documentation, and for like new people coming in and trying to build on Railgun, understanding how the different parts of the system work without having to dig through this giant code base, it makes this a much more approachable, much more like easier initial first step.
I think that Kai's really hit it on the head. I think the only thing that I'll say is, like, effectively, at least in my opinion, a lot of the cool stuff that we want is behind this, right? This is a necessity. Making the SDK more modular basically allows us to um, build Railgun v3. It allows Connect to be built. It allows better PPOI architecture. It unlocks a lot of potential with Railgun, and it's pretty exciting. And I don't want to disparage the Railgun community SDK. It definitely works, and has gotten the protocol to several billions of dollars in cumulative volume. But, like I said, building anything with Railgun basically means you got to run the entire SDK. And that's a huge challenge, especially when you're working with like finicky, complex code like Railgun. So it's pretty exciting. And, I would say that like, this isn't like future building, like this isn't like hopes and dreams. Like, this is work that's happening right now. You can check it out. It's on it's on GitHub. Railgun Reloaded. It's pretty cool to see like the hyper complex SDK get peeled down into digestible modules that even like a janitor like me can understand. So it's a pretty bullish development, if you ask me.
Well, every hero faces a dark moment. 2024 was a year of growth for the protocol. However, there was a lot of growing pains. For example, there were a few periods where users were having broadcasting reliability issues with Railway and had to depend on self-broadcasting. Can you explain how Railgun has overcome this challenge?
Before it was a crazy year, right? I think like at the beginning of the year, like the protocol TVL, let's take a look, was around 20 million ish, and by the end of the year had like peaked out at almost 200 million, which was a pretty large growth for the protocol, and that put a lot of strain on the way that the protocol ultimately worked and the wallets that supported it worked. The tech that's the substrate for broadcasting and communicating with broadcasters it's hyper new, and it's pretty interesting and complex. And so getting that right has certainly been a challenge. And like as that ecosystem grew and like more broadcasters came in, it started to become like a really big challenge, because it was hard to figure out which broadcasters were reliable and which ones weren't, or even trying to figure out whether or not a broadcaster was quoting you with a wallet that had gas for fees. And so these are all, it's sort of like, I guess like a, maybe not, classic's a wrong word, but it's sort of like a classic problem whenever you're building like hyper new tech. You're sort of wading blind in like muddy waters, and so you don't really have a lot of guidance from history to look at and say like, well, protocol XYZ did it this way, so we should do it that way. But I think that a lot of the reliability issues are certainly behind. At least from broadcaster perspective, there really hasn't been a lot of issues with that. 2024 has been a year of growth, but yeah, it's been a year of tech debt to, sort of, figuring out ways to make sure that a lot of the infrastructure is reliable. And that whenever people build this into a wallet that it's going to work like it's expected to. And that's not really easy whenever there isn't a playbook.
Yeah, I mean, I think the these sort of like issues, are kind of inherent with bootstrapping a decentralized project and decentralized network, right? So, one of the things that you get, which is very nice when you're building a centralized system, is you can actually have some fairly certain guarantees about the reliability of the hardware, the internet connection, and all of these sort of things, like the reliability of the resources that these systems are running on, right? But as soon as you go into decentralized land, right, you have this, extreme variety in where, where things are being run, what they're being run on, maybe like, okay, well, you get random blackouts. Maybe someone's trying to sit there and modify the software or like do something weird, right? And so there's going to naturally be these extra growing pains and difficulties that you have to deal with when you're trying to like bootstrap and grow these like decentralized systems. And I think that's really like what you saw with some of the broadcast reliability things. It's this decentralized system that as people scale and different kinds of participants enter and exit, it's going to reveal problems, and your tech's going to have to adapt around that. And I think that's just a necessary process of building things the right way, right? It's a challenge. It's really annoying to have to go through, but ultimately it's a much better protocol that you get at the end of it.
After a big challenge, the hero claims a reward. Railgun's seen successes like the impressive fee growth within Railgun through railway use, over 3 billion in shielded volume, and over 87 million in TVL. How do you plan to keep this shocking growth alive as new competitors and new chains emerge that compete with Ethereum?
So, yeah, where are these chains that compete with Ethereum? I think that doesn't exist, at least in my mind, but I'm very much so bullish on, the long-term trajectory of Ethereum and where it's going. I've been around the ecosystem for a pretty reasonable amount of time, and a lot of the things that are happening around Ethereum are working, right? Gas is, getting cheaper, right? And that's really, really great. In fact, gas got so cheap that Etherscan had to add decimal points to their little gas ticker because it was pegged at 0 for so long. People were like, free gas, but it was just in the decimals. And so I think that there isn't really a lot of competition for Ethereum, but I think that the growth for Railgun's been really cool, right? Especially when it comes to like fee growth, right? I don't know, 2022 was doing like something like $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month in like transaction fees to the treasury, to now doing something like $500,000 every month in transaction fees for the treasury. And that's really cool to see. That basically means that the treasury is going to make something like 7 million, or if ETH actually moves in the right direction, that I personally, not financial advice, would want to see would be even more, but it's going to produce something like $7 million a year annual in fees, which is really, really cool because the project doesn't burn a lot in grants. If you look through all the old DAO proposals and things like this, it doesn't really spend a ton of money to develop. And I think it's going to continue to do this sort of growth. We've sort of seen like the growth do like these different plateaus. And so it went from 2022 doing 10 to maybe 5 to 10 to $7,000 a month in fee volume. And then in 23, it started to trickle up into the high 5 figures, up into the 6-figure mark, doing 100,000 in fee volume. And now 2024, it's 3, 4, 5x that, and hopefully we'll continue to see that grow. I think though, in order to do that, right, Railgun has to continue to innovate, and that mission of making 0ZK addresses have like true parity with public addresses is really, really critical. So seeing new types of DeFi interactions come to fruition, see new chains come into the ecosystem, and more L2 support into the future is going to be really important. Being able to tie in bridging and all of these different things is going to be really key. Railgun's got really great bullish metrics. The things that are being built now are hyper exciting, and I'm excited to see, how the growth continues from here, frankly.
I think the trend. While economic activity might not be happening on Ethereum directly, right? Or at least that's not where the growth might be. The trend still is for all these sort of these different chains that were competitors maybe at some point in the past. They've sort of kind of melded in or merged in with the Ethereum ecosystem, and like a lot of them are just sort of ending up as rollups or companion chains to Ethereum. And so I don't think, given the trajectory of where we're going, I don't think we're really going to see a dethroning of Ethereum, at least not while it continues to innovate. Railgun, I think generally is going to continue to be developed on Ethereum, and maybe in the future, if there are some other chains with sort of like equivalent economic activity, maybe we see a Railgun get developed there as well. But for the moment, I think. The Ethereum space is where it's at. I think a good number of EIPs that are coming out in the Ethereum space and the EVM space are going to be quite beneficial to Railgun and allow some much nicer sort of like native tying in of Railgun into a sort of Ethereum transaction workflow. And so I think ultimately where Railgun's kind of headed is, effectively just being like the native or standard like privacy method of interacting with whatever you want to do on Ethereum.
Wow, what a journey it's been. Thank you, Alan and Kai, for sharing Railgun's story. To everyone listening, check out railgun.org. Join the community on X, Discord, and Telegram, and keep pushing for privacy in crypto. Until next time, this is Railgun Intern signing off.